In the beginning of March, the Trump administration announced plans to remove the legal refugee status of over 240,000 Ukrainians living in the United States. This means they could quickly be deported to their native country, which is presently a war zone.
When making political arguments in defense of refugees, Christians often reference the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, claiming that this means Jesus was a refugee and thus Christians should stand in support of refugees. Even the Vatican has published various documents citing Jesus' refugee status. But was he really?
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm happy that it's Friday, happy that spring is beginning. How are you doing?
Well, it was snowing this morning at my house, so I'm not sure about spring, but closer than it was a couple weeks ago. I'll give you that.
It was actually snowing a little bit here too. So I've been following this situation with Ukraine. Something similar happened, I believe, with the Haitians and the Venezuelans as far as Trump ending their temporary protected status. There are a couple of lawsuits right now trying to keep this from happening. Everything's really up in the air, though.
Today's guest is going to talk to us about how to understand what's happening through a Christian ethical lens. We talk about what it means to be a refugee, the significance of Jesus fleeing from Bethlehem to Egypt, and whether we can accurately call Jesus a refugee by today's standards. I'm Emily Sana, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's thank the people who make this podcast possible.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. Was Jesus a refugee?
Today we're talking to Glenn Butner, an associate professor of theology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and the author of multiple books on theology and social ethics, including Jesus the Refugee, Ancient Injustice and Modern Solidarity.
The book explores the Holy Family's flight to Egypt through the lens of modern legal definitions of refugees and asks whether Jesus and his parents would be protected if they fled today. Would they receive rights to employment and civic engagement? Would they be turned away? What legal options would they have? Based on the answers to these questions, Glenn then challenges our current refugee system, arguing that it does not provide for the least of these whom Jesus commands us to care for.
For more information about Jesus the Refugee or the rest of Glenn's work, please check out the show notes for today's episode on our website. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I was looking over your bio and I saw that you did your undergraduate work at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was down there around the same time. My family has a lot of connections in the area.
Oh,
Did
great.
you enjoy it? Did you enjoy being in Chapel Hill?
Yeah, it was a wonderful time. Great friends, great academic context. Yeah, and I still cheer for Carolina Blue in most sports. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Very good.
You've written an entire book called Jesus the Refugee. What led you to write this book and to start thinking about Jesus in terms of refugees and immigrants?
Yeah, good question. Actually, some of it goes back to my Carolina days, so well-planned segue there. But experiences working with refugees and migrants in different contexts, including through a class at UNC, had me generally interested in ministry to refugees and in thinking about refugee ethics in general. But like all good books, this one started with a social media debate. As I saw two people arguing back and forth on whether or not Jesus was a refugee, with one side saying, well, of course he's not a refugee, that's anachronistic. And then the other side saying, well, of course he is a refugee, he had to flee for his life. And I just thought there has to be a more productive theological conversation we can have about this question. And so that prompted me to start researching it and eventually write the book.
So yeah, some background on that. I've had similar social media debates. Why do we say that Jesus was a refugee? I mean, if you could just kind of give some scriptural context for that for people who are less familiar with the argument.
Yeah. Well, obviously from from Scripture, there's going to be a huge component coming out of Matthew 2, where there's this narrative of after the wise men come, which many people in churches are familiar with from, all sorts of Advent and Christmas and post-Christmas stories. But there's a dark side to this because Herod, after hearing that the Magi are looking for a new king, comes to kill the children that fit within the time frame that could be the new king to replace him. And so an angel comes and tells the Magi to go way by a different route and tells Joseph to wake his family up and to flee down into Egypt. And so it's that flight that becomes the basis for a lot of people talking about his refugee status. And then I think the other part is just the biblical mandate to love our neighbor leads a lot of people to want to find ways to connect Christ and his story to that love. And so maybe they're not even familiar with this specific biblical text in any detail or the refugee system in any detail, but they know they want to love refugees, and they just know a little bit about Jesus having to go to Egypt. And so, moved by that love, they try to make the comparison.
So, is that kind of an anachronistic comparison? What did Jesus's culture and era have anything similar to our contemporary concept of being a refugee that they would have understood Jesus and his family as kind of fitting that category?
Yeah, it's a bit anachronistic, and yet there is something of a parallel. And that's where I think it's helpful to move beyond just calling Jesus a refugee. But there was not the complex legal system that we have now. There was not the complex system of border security, though there was something of a border security system in place. Citizenship worked very differently, so there's a lot different. But we can say that there is a biblical category with some basic affinities, and that would be the category of the ger, the resident alien, the sojourner, coming out of the Old Testament. And so this would include a lot of people, not just what we would call today refugees, but any foreigner at the time was especially vulnerable because they were away from their family and they probably didn't own land. And in the economy and political circumstances of the time, that meant that they lacked the social structures and economic support that most people had. And so this category for a longstanding migrant who's in a position that's vulnerable would have been familiar to people back in Jesus's day, and surely he would have been seen through that light by the Jewish community that was in Egypt, perhaps Alexandria, if that's where he went. We know there was a large Jewish community there, and they probably would have thought of his family along those lines. And so there is a category, but it's not quite the same as the category that we have today. Though, of course, they knew that some people were migrants because they fled for their life. And so in that basic way, there is that similarity.
So, could you talk a little bit about laws or customs at Jesus's time about how these categories of refugees, I'll call them, were to be treated? Whether there was customs and whether there were any kind of like legal protections or anti-protections?
Yes. So there were certainly both customs and official teachings in Scripture if we're looking at sort of the Jewish context. And there would have been a little bit, I think less in a Greco-Roman context as well. Broadly speaking, in the ancient Near Eastern context, going back even before Rome was in the area of Judea, we have a consistent emphasis in ancient Near Eastern laws for the poor, for widows, and for orphans as the most vulnerable, but a conspicuous absence of emphasis on the ger. And that's regularly included. You see care for the poor, widows, orphans, and aliens or sojourners in Old Testament law. So there's this really unique emphasis among God's people to care for the vulnerable migrant. That would include legal protections like economic care. There are clear laws saying they had to be paid their wages at the end of the day. You shouldn't wait a week to pay them because they're in an economically precarious situation. They should have no bias against them in the courts. They had access to things like gleaning, where the final sort of fruits coming from the harvest that weren't picked should be left. Don't harvest the second time, leave it for those migrants that are living in the land. And there were avenues for integration into the religious life of Israel. That would be coupled with, across the ancient Mediterranean world, an emphasis on the virtue of hospitality, which would be understood as offering provision and protection to someone who had come from far away. And those things would be especially urgent if someone had to flee for their life, and that was the reason that they had traveled. So there were certainly a lot of things that would have been in place to care for many different vulnerable groups, whether it would technically fit our definition of refugees or asylum seekers, or just those who had traveled into a country out of economic need. They would be protected in Israelite law. In fact, we would see direct teachings, for example, Leviticus 19:4, that the ger residing among the people should be treated as the native born. We should love them as we love ourselves, for the people of Israel were foreigners in Egypt. And then the law ends with, I am the Lord your God. So this care for the foreigner is part of the identity of the people of Israel, because they had experienced the opposite of care when they were in Egypt.
So these teachings about how to treat aliens, refugees, migrants, whatever the definition of the terminology is as old as scriptures itself.
Yes.
But how about the idea that Jesus was a member of this group? Is this kind of more of a modern discussion that people are having to in regards to modern definitions of refugees, or is this something that people have been interpreting all along?
Yes, so there's such a broad history of Christian literature that I don't want to confidently say, here's where it started, but I can share some older examples. It's not just a modern phenomenon, though interest in that has peaked. As we'll talk about later on, today a refugee is someone who flees because of persecution. And so we start seeing a lot of religious persecution during the time of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and all of that religious tension in Europe. The wars of religion are happening, and so you have people of all religious or Christian religious backgrounds fleeing. And in that context, you see a lot of people advocating for care for those who are fleeing because of their religious beliefs. And this is coming from all perspectives. So you can find sermons from Martin Luther, for example, where he's looking at Matthew 2 and he's arguing, first of all, interestingly, that it's okay to run away and save your life in these wars of religion because Jesus and his family ran away from danger. But second, there's an emphasis on care for those who have to run away to save their life, with the idea that Jesus was a refugee who needed care as well. We can see something like this in the New Testament even. Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, talks about Jesus sorting people based on how they responded to the least of these. And among those, he would include not only those who are hungry or visiting those who are in prison, but welcoming the stranger. And so if you read the history of Christian interpretation of this passage, they'll say, if you welcome the stranger, it's like you're welcoming Jesus. And he had some of the experiences of the stranger, since he was an itinerant preacher and since he had to go down to Egypt in his youth. And so you can find instances, but it's really picked up in the last century. Massive displacement of peoples through World War I and World War II. And so much more emphasis at that point, including significantly in a Catholic context, some encyclical teachings addressing Jesus as a refugee, an exul familia.
So you've mentioned this a bit, but maybe just for our audience and for the sake of us hosts too, if you could talk a bit about what it technically legally means to be a refugee today, and if we were to kind of transpose Jesus's circumstances from 2,000 years ago to the modern context, would it then be anachronistic to refer to him as a refugee?
Yes, and this kind of gets to the meat of where my research has been. I worry that it's not helpful enough to talk about Jesus being a refugee just to try and bring about an emotional response, as important as that is, because it may leave us in a position where we're uninformed about the actual system. So the actual refugee system today is largely governed by the 1951 Refugee Protocol, which was somewhat updated in 1967, and which most countries around the world have adopted and then incorporated into their own laws. So in the US context, this would be the 1980 Refugee Act. And according to that definition, you are a refugee if you have a well-founded fear of persecution and have left your country, and if that persecution is on the basis of certain relevant categories like political opinions, ethnicity, or religion. And so if your home country is trying to kill you, or they're denying you legal rights in court, or they're forbidding you from working because of, your race or because of your particular religion, then you legally have a right under international law to leave your country and be protected by the country that you enter into, where that protection would include such things as access to employment and a pathway to citizenship, and most importantly, protection from refoulement, which is sort of a fancy term to talk about being sent back to where you came from. And so if we ask, would Jesus fit this category? Pretty much. There's the catch is that At the time, obviously, Egypt was controlled by the Roman Empire, and so technically he didn't leave Rome to then have protection from Rome. He did leave where Herod lived, so we can get into the grass and the weeds and sort of debate, did he leave, did he not leave? But there was no refugee convention that would have led him to try to leave for protection at that point. So instead in the book, I say, what if he tried to leave now? Would he classify as a refugee if he tried to come to the EU or the United States? And I think that's a clear answer of yes, because he is targeted, trying to be killed because of sort of this hybrid religious / political claim to kingship. And so he has to run away. It would be a well-founded fear. Herod's got a background of really atrocious things to his opponents. And so he would fit as a refugee. But because he has that status legally, there's still the question of would he be able to get that status recognized in court? And would he be able to successfully cross a border to have that status designated? And that, I think, is a much more precarious thing. Much of our court system is set up to try and eliminate the number of asylum claims that are granted. And if a refugee were to go to a refugee camp, for example, they often wait for an average of 14 years before resettlement. So is he a refugee if he were hypothetically speaking in our system today? Yes, but would we acknowledge that fact? I'm not quite so sure. And that's where I think we hit the ethical pay dirt of saying, well, if we wouldn't protect Jesus today, what do we need to do about our system to address that?
Yeah, so that's a good transition to my next question, which is why does all this matter? Why does it matter reframing this discussion in the way you did in your book? Kind of what's at stake, both in terms of our civil society, but then also in terms of theology?
Yes, this is a great question. In terms of civil society, I think we need to take a hard look at how we're actually addressing refugees. And we also need to recognize that they're a distinct category. I have opinions, many listeners will have opinions about all sorts of different types of immigrants, but each one is in a different ethical situation. And the refugee is especially vulnerable because they're facing death in their home country. And of course, the right to life is one of the most fundamental rights that God has given us because life is one of the most fundamental gifts. And so we need to find ways to protect the lives of those in danger. And so in the book, I walk through lots of ways that our civil society is set up to try and not protect the refugee. And I end with a call to solidarity, to standing with the refugee on the basis of texts like Matthew 25, whatever we do to the least of these, we do to Christ. And that's going to take institutional solidarity, which involves maybe changing of laws, sometimes conflictual solidarity, where we have to stand in opposition to things that are unjust, but also incarnational solidarity, where we, in our ministry, actually help those who are refugees. It's especially important for people today because of the way that refugees are not receiving public funding as much at the moment, for the church to step in, because there are refugees who are extremely vulnerable, not having the economic support and opportunities that they should have. And so churches and individuals can sort of fill that gap right now, showing solidarity.
Well, that's really helpful for kind of building out both the theological and the practical implications of this. And that's all our questions for today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Wow. Glenn did a lot to change my internal framing of the question and what it means to say Jesus was a refugee. I have a lot to think about now. And to help us unpack some of his points a little more, our senior editor and producer, Sarah, is here to help.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi guys.
So what'd you think?
Yeah, I think that what really kind of surprised me about this is how much of the debate around this question was Jesus a refugee is about legal definitions when I've always come at it with like the most important takeaway is how the story connects to the experiences of like refugees today and people who are fleeing some sort of persecution. But it struck me how much discussion there was about what refugee status means and why it's important to also know the historical context.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting like a legal seminar when
Right.
we when we interviewed him. I think I'm glad though. Like I'm glad that he was really trying to focus on not was Jesus a refugee as in some like a pie in the sky like just something we say, but really trying to focus on would we support Jesus had he lived today?
Yeah, I think that there's a real merit in unpacking the legal aspect because there's so much ignorance around that. So many people will say, yeah, we welcome them if they're legal. And then they turn around and say, well, but we're not these people and not these people. And, we've already addressed the fact that there are people who are facing deportation right now who have legal status. If that can be revoked that easily, though, that's very worrying.
So, one thing I'm realizing about me is that I don't think I know the difference between, say, an immigrant and a refugee. And I wonder if that's something that a lot of people don't really understand.
Right, and I think people also use, like, terms interchangeably. I mean, we, talk about migrants, we talk about refugees, and I think you could be a migrant and a refugee, but it's complicated, and it's also hard to then for, a pastor in a parish to talk about this topic.
So it does seem like we have kind of two different tiers of conversation, and that it's important for us as citizens to be aware of what the legal ramifications are and the parameters around refugees and migrants and asylum seekers and what's required. And I know it's a very lengthy process, but then there's the other issue is are these laws aligned with morality, natural law?
Yeah, and I also think it's important to say you can believe that immigration shouldn't be uncontrolled and also think that refugees specifically deserve protection. Because Glenn gave a definition that is very specific and it's people who are going to be killed in their own countries. And we can say that we're going to protect those people, that is our moral responsibility to do as a country, and still think that we should maybe not have unlimited immigration from other places.
Yeah, there's this weird situation where if you defend the rights of refugees or immigrants and people say, well, we can't have open borders as though that's the only option. This idea that we couldn't possibly have a controlled immigration situation that's also humane and rooted in ethics. And like, why can't we have a situation where we protect the fundamental rights both of citizens and non citizens? What a radical idea.
So was there anything you wish he had gone into more detail about?
I'm always really fascinated with the history at the time, but this is just me being a nerd who feels too strongly perhaps about Roman politics and the fact that Rome had, annexed Egypt, which was not cool, I think.
Yeah, I know that you wanted to talk about like the relationship between Herod and Judea and Egypt and Rome and kind of how all of the politics would have interwoven at the time. I don't know if you know anything about that or if that's anything we can answer.
Yeah, it would be interesting because Herod was like a client king, so he did owe allegiance to Rome and Egypt. I don't remember whether Egypt was a client state or not, and also owed allegiance to Rome. So yeah, they were part under the same imperial umbrella, but they're still separate countries with their own rulers, even if the rulers are kind of oppressed by the Roman Empire. Although in Herod's case, he deserved to be oppressed.
I know this wasn't really the point of the discussion, but I do think there was more that we could have talked about in terms of Catholic social teaching and what various encyclicals have said about the Holy Family being refugees and how that relates to our responsibility to care for refugees. I mean, that's a whole interview in and of itself, that there's a wealth of material there. But I do wish, just for kind of the purposes of our listeners and our own discussion, we'd had a little more time to get into that.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to explore further how this perspective could reshape or does reshape Christian attitudes toward refugees now. I would like to know just more about how churches are or aren't engaging with this right now. There's certainly a lot that is worth engaging with that I wonder, like, do churches have like the tools to engage with this topic too, or do average Catholics know where to look if they want to support refugees and what organizations? And that's where I want to go from here.
It does seem like even if we're not sure how or where or why, it's pretty clear that part of our Christian obligation is to support and welcome refugees. That's kind of a non negotiable. And I know encyclicals have made that clear.
Okay, so before we wrap up, we're going to do one final question, which is real quick. in 2 sentences or less. If you were to speak about today's discussion in the context of a homily, what would the closing challenge to the congregation be?
My closing challenge would be for Christians to start taking Jesus' words in the Gospels seriously when he says to welcome the immigrant and the refugee as though they were Jesus. And he has some pretty harsh penalties for people who don't do that. So I might give a fire and brimstone sermon.
Yeah, I mean, I come away with it also just thinking that I want people to realize that if you truly believe in the incarnation, you think God became human, experienced human suffering, how you treat refugees and migrants is, directly tied to how you treat Jesus himself. I mean, can't really argue with that.
I think there's something to be said to his point about we're way too comfortable having these discussions on social media. And as long as we keep doing that, we're never going to be able to get deeper and have kind of a deeper understanding of what it really means to say Jesus is a refugee. And not just about refugees or immigrants, but about any of the issues. Not that disagreement is not important, but I think we're just all too comfortable getting behind our keyboards and shooting off aphorisms at people. And so that would be my takeaway for a congregation.
And that's our show. Thanks for listening. We hope you keep asking the hard questions about our faith, even when there are no easy answers.
If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a story you'd like to share about what your church is doing to support refugees? Or do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org.
And please join us next week when we'll be discussing how a new pope gets chosen.
Before we wrap up, we're excited to share a new ministry for immigrants and anyone impacted by forced migration. This ministry is led by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. Somos, Together We Are Faith, Hope, and Strength, is a social media campaign offering spiritual care and resources for immigrants on their journey. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Help us spread the word and support the migrant community. To learn more, visit claretians.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.